The regulation of respiration, the main objective of this mechanism, of this process, is to keep the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the blood pH within normal physiological ranges in arterial blood. Now, how does the body achieve this? It uses 3 factors. It has got sensors that detect changes in these parameters. Then once it senses, it sends input signals to the central controllers. Now that determine the appropriate response for the change that has been picked up. So once it senses and determines which response to give, it sends its output signals to the effectors that are going to implement the change that it so desires to see. These are the 3 factors. Now, what function to be the sensors? The chemoreceptors, the pulmonary receptors primarily. The chemoreceptors, there are 2. We have the central chemoreceptors and the peripheral chemoreceptors. The central chemoreceptors, these ones are located in the brain. And what is the major stimulant? Low pH in the brain tissue. A low pH in the brain tissue is what will stimulate the central chemoreceptors. Then the peripheral chemoreceptors, by and large, we are talking about the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies. These ones, major stimulant, low partial pressure of oxygen. A partial pressure of less than 60 millimeters of mercury will stimulate these peripheral chemoreceptors to send input signals. Then the pulmonary receptors, for example, we're talking about the stretch receptors as well as the juxtacapillary receptors. The stretch receptors, their main role is to simply signal to the brain that you have inspired enough and the volume that you've taken in is enough, because this new volume that you've continued to take in is now stretching me. So it therefore signals the brain to do what? To inhibit inspiration and induce expiration so that you don't overinflate the lungs. That is what the stretch receptors do. The juxtacapillary receptors, these ones detect fluid, the presence of fluid in the lungs. So these are the sensors, chemoreceptors, central and peripheral. Once they detect these changes, they send input to the central controllers. Now in the central controllers, there are 2 main important areas, the cortex and the brainstem. The cortex is for voluntary control. When you choose to voluntarily hold your breath, what is functioning there is the cerebral cortex. Then the brainstem has got 2 areas, the pons and the medulla. The pons contain 2 respiratory centers, the pneumotaxic center and the apneustic center. These 2 centers, they function antagonistically. The pneumotaxic center, the main function of the pneumotaxic center is to inhibit inspiration by way of sending inhibitory signals to the apneustic center. The apneustic center, the main function is for inspiration. Pneumotaxic inhibits inspiration by sending inhibitory signals to the pneumotaxic. Pneumotaxic functions to cause inspiration. Then the medulla contains 2 centers, 2 groups of cells, the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group causes or functions to induce expiration. The dorsal respiratory group functions to cause inspiration. And these have their output signals or transmit their output signals via for example, the dorsal respiratory group sends its output signals via the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves. The phrenic nerve goes to the diaphragm to cause contraction of the diaphragm muscle. The intercostal nerve goes to the external intercostal muscles and causes the contraction of the external intercostal muscles. Contraction of these 2 different muscles causes ventilation, an increase in ventilation. Then the VRG, the ventral respiratory group, has got fibers that go to accessory muscles of respiration, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the scalene muscles, the abdominal muscles. All these are influenced by information coming from the ventral respiratory group of cells. Now, remember that the main reason why this system exists is to keep the levels of what? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and arterial blood pH within normal physiological ranges that can support and sustain life. That is why these mechanisms exist, and they work together to ensure that this is achieved. Cheers.